Hey, it's Jim, and this is level 1 of the CFA program, the topic on equity investments, and the learning module on industry and competitive analysis. This learning module fits really snugly in between macroeconomic analysis and security analysis. I imagine there are lots of you that love an economic analysis. You probably love talking about and investigating inflation and interest rates, GDP, exchange rates, and unemployment rates. And there are lots of really cool things that you can do. We spent a lot of time in quantitative methods talking about how we can use that macroeconomic analyses to help us in our regular old financial analysis framework. And I imagine there are probably even more of you that love security analysis, trying to find undervalued or overvalued individual securities or companies. We can use just a simple model like the Myron Gordon growth model, or a way more complex model like Monte Carlo simulation with 50 inputs. But essentially in security analysis, we're trying to find securities that are overvalued or undervalued so that we can make a recommendation to our clients. Well, industry analysis fits, what did I say, snugly in the middle. And even though it's not nearly as exciting, at least for me, and dare I even use the word sexy? Am I allowed to use that word in a financial recording? As security and macroeconomic analysis, but the CFA Institute attaches equal importance to it. This is what I tell my students, and I think you'll see that this is what the Institute emphasizes in this particular learning module. I say to my students, look, pick an industry and go out and find two important variables. What is the total size of that industry? And then what is its growth rate? You know, let's suppose that I'm Jim's Pretzel Factory, and I want to know how many pretzels were sold in the United States last year. Well, that's an easy Google search. You can find this in less than 5 seconds. So in 2021 or 2022, whatever year it was, there were $7 or $8 billion worth of pretzels sold in the United States. So the question then becomes, here's that current total market. Where's it going to go in the future? Is it going to be 10 billion in 5 years, or is it going to be 5 billion in 5 years? So we need to couple the total market's value and the growth rate in that and link it not only upwards to macroeconomic analysis, but downwards to security analysis to help us find overvalued or undervalued securities. And I think that's a good summary of what these LOSs are going to ask us to do on the exam, right? Purpose, that makes perfect sense. Classification methods, right? We have all these industries out there. We need to find out what particular firm belongs in which particular industry. And then look at that third one there, size, growth, profitability, that's all good stuff. And then the Institute is very big on extracting valuable models from other disciplines like management and bringing them into our financial analysis. So we'll talk about Porter, we'll talk about PESTLE, and then we'll end with an example on competitive strategy. So here's a slide that you saw back in the previous learning module. There we go, number 1, we did past and present. So we did all that stuff. Here we are in the middle now, industry and competitive analysis. And then in the next learning module, we'll go ahead and talk about forecasting. So I want you to think about how industry analysis fits into what the Institute has us focusing on in these 3 learning modules. There they are, 1, 2, and 3, and how it fits into the larger macro and security analyses. All right, so let me address that first LOS. Describe the purpose of. You ready for this? The purpose of. Skip all the way down to the final diamond point. Overall, the industry landscape sets a foundational profitability. This is what I was saying earlier. Here's the big picture. How many pretzels were sold in the United States last year? What's the growth rate? And then here's that second component that I hinted at in my introduction. The second component is, hey, let's suppose we're evaluating Jim's Pretzel Factory. How much of that total market can Jim capture? What is that market share? Can Jim's Pretzel Factory capture? And then what does that mean for Jim's Pretzel Factory financial statements? What does it mean for the assets, liabilities, and equity? And then more importantly, what does it mean for the bottom right-hand side of the income statement? We'll call it profitability. So if you look at the LOS, the purpose of, what do we have in bolded up there? The fundamental operational characteristics of a particular industry. Think of the snack industry with pretzels and potato chips, right? And then think of the financial institutions industry. Well, are these two things related? Well, they're related at the bottom of the income statement, right? Each of these industries wants to generate sustainable net income. But how they get there are two completely different ways. So what are those operational characteristics? What about raw materials? What about market share? What about human capital? What about talent? What about all that kind of stuff? And then we can't forget about the supply chain. And the Institute goes to great lengths to inject this supply chain, right? So we're taking this from, some kind of a, quantitative management operations or supply chain discipline. And we're saying stuff like, all right, what's going on this side and on this side? Those of you who have access to the Bloomberg terminal, just type in a company like Apple or Amazon, and then go to the supply chain function, and you'll see the company in the middle, and you'll see all the companies over here on this side of the supply chain, all of them over here on this side of the supply chain. And so that gives you a sense of, common demand trends, supply chain complexities, overarching risks. Environment exposes them, that competitive environment. And then here's where we're going to physically bring in these Porter's 5 forces, which there's an emphasis on supply chain. So look at the first one, bargaining power of suppliers. Look at the fourth one, bargaining power of buyers. And then complementary to that is threats of new entrants, competitive rivalry, and then substitute products or services. So those 5 forces, they could essentially be, squished down. There's another word. Can I use the word squish? Squished into, this is really a supply chain issue, but it's much more than just, you take the raw materials and you make something and then you have something here. So what do I do in my Jim's pretzel factory? I don't even know how to make a pretzel. What do I need? I need wheat, probably, corn, dough, I don't know, water, sugar, salt. So I get all that stuff and I pound it together and I put it in an oven and there's a pretzel, right? So how do you go from the farm to the shelf at Target? Well, that's what those 5 forces are asking us to evaluate. But remember, and I think this is really the most likely exam question. The Institute could give you a whole bunch of this stuff up at the top and say, how is this going to impact profitability? That is the key. So notice we have this thing here. I love this marginal cost, marginal benefit. You probably see me do this pretty regularly. There are at least 2 great exam questions. So this is a tug of war between, are you ready? The security analysis here, the reading calls it company specific factors. What did I say? That's super sexy. The industry analysis, kind of dull, right? How many bags of pretzels do you sell last year? I don't know. It's hard to get excited about that as an analyst, but what's really important is that bolded phrase inside of the first bullet point there. I can imagine the Institute giving you a question stem where they say something like, hey, we're evaluating Jim's pretzel factory and his dividend yield is 4%, but the industry dividend yield is 5%. Which one is more important? Or which one do you attach more weight to? So let's go ahead and read this together. That security analysis, those company-specific factors, they hold greater impact in general. However, there's a comma. However, those industry dynamics, right? If the dividend yield is higher in the pretzel industry, then that's probably going to flow down to Jim's Pretzel Factory financial statements, right? So those industry dynamics, what they can do is they can not only influence what's going on inside of Jim's Pretzel Factory, but they can establish, maybe a minimum or a maximum. The Institute, they put this in the terms of a cap on profitability, but don't limit it to a cap because there can be other factors that would provide it with a floor. So that's important. That last sentence there, excuse me. I can envision the Institute saying something like, hey, here are these 5 firms in the pretzel industry. They each made $100,000 in net income last year. Does that mean that Jim's Pretzel Factory should make $100,000 this year or next year? So, of course, what's going on in the industry is not a guarantee of what's going to happen inside of our financial statements. Let's go ahead and take a slide and focus on the part of the LOS that asks us to describe the purpose of an industry, right? The importance of analyzing an industry. So these are 2 really, really easy exam questions, and this is not surprising. Improving forecasts. If we take my Jim's Pretzel Factory example, we take a look at the industry and we see what's going on out there using those Porter's 5 forces. But we can answer questions that sound something like, hey, maybe there's Betty's pretzel factory over there, and she makes a better pretzel than Jim does, at least according to some tastes, and she does it at a lower cost. So sooner or later, Jim's profitability is going to fall. So we need to look at the competition, and we need to look at the supply chain. Look at that bottom part there. Importance of a bird's eye view of the industry. First time I ever heard that concept, bird's eye view, I was a freshman in college and I took a theater class. It was a movie cinema class. And we watched one of those Hitchcock movies where he used the bird's eye view. I'll let you guys figure out what movie that was. I'm sure you weren't even born when that was made. So, all right, so improving forecasts, what does that mean? Let me go back here real quick. It means, look down at the bottom. We already read this. Landscape sets a foundational profitability. All right. So it's going to improve our forecast of profitability, but it's also going to improve our forecast of everything else on the financial statements. Not just assets, liabilities, and equities, not just revenues, expenses, but all the cash flows that show up on the cash flow statement. So you get a sense of what's going on in the global industry, which then gives you a better ability to predict what's going on in the little micro firm, Jim's Pretzel Factory. And then as we're looking at Betty's Pretzel Factory over here, it might be that Betty also makes potato chips. And maybe when we peek into her factory over there, we're seeing that she makes really good potato chips and her margins are super high. And so we're starting to think, wait a minute, maybe this is a positive net present value project. Maybe we should start making potato chips. Let's see what Betty's doing over there. And then maybe Jim can do something better. So look at that bottom bullet point there. The Institute emphasized, diversification with a basket approach. So we can do pretzels, we can do cookies, we can do potato chips, we could do chocolate covered potato chips, right? We could do this, we could do that. Any of you guys watch Monty Python? We could do a chocolate covered frog. There's your homework assignment. Go find that for Monty Python. All right, how about if we're going to define this industry? So this is important. We're going to say something like, all right, we know we got all these firms out there. How can we classify them? How can we group them? Well, we've got to approach this in a structured manner. So first of all, we're going to define the industry, and we're not going to do it ourselves. There are lots and lots of people out there that define industry, and we'll see over the next couple of slides how these organizations do this. And of course, it requires judgment. I mean, what do you do? With Jim's Pretzel Factory, right? I'm in the pretzel industry. But Betty over there, she's making pretzels and potato chips. I mean, is she in the pretzel industry? Is she in the potato chip industry? Do we lump her in with the snack food industry? These are really, really good questions. And remember, this classification system is not perfect, right? You're going to have some overlap. I mean, think of a company like Apple. What do? You guys heard me say this before. I don't have an Apple iPhone, and I hope to never have an Apple iPhone. But everybody in my family does. Most of you guys probably do. And so does that mean that I'm not a candidate, that I'm not a potential customer for Apple products? And the answer, of course, is no, right? I mean, I buy songs on iTunes all the time. And so, Apple, what kind of industry are they in? Well, you could lump it into some big one, but then you can kind of micro slice them into sub industries. And that's what this definition is going to help us do, based on things like size, growth rates, character, profitability, market share trends, any other factors that you can come up with. We're going to go ahead and look at those Porter's 5 forces. We're going to do the PESTLE. We're going to do a competitive analysis, which is kind of a complementary model to Porter and to PESTLE. All right, so how are we going to define an industry? We can do this a couple of different ways, but I want to call your attention to the word in that second diamond point. Complex. This is what I was just saying a moment ago, right? More than one industry, geography, updating classifications. I mean, what do you do with a company like Johnson & Johnson, who used to have 3 business segments? Now they only have 2. Does that mean that you strip them out of the consumer products industry? Probably. But we need somebody who's an expert to do these kinds of things. And there are a couple of them listed down there at the bottom. So I think the really good exam questions are something that sounds like, hey, here's Jim's pretzel factory. What industry is it most likely to be classified as? Now, there's a difference between old-time classification and new-time classification. I get that word old-time because my older son used to say old-time stuff. And this is what my colleagues in my School of Business, they refer to this all the time. The Standard Industrial Classification, SIC, right? What are those things? The important question that I think will show up, although I don't really think these are good questions on the exams, but I'm guessing that if the Institute asks this, it'll be in that second bullet point there, production characteristics. And let me go here, just give you a heads up here. Look at the first one there, demand approach or similarity of products. And so these are kind of 2 things. So these legacy schemes, think about production characteristics, this is the way I think of industries, because I'm an old time dude, right? Agricultural, retail, services, whatever it is, snack food industry. But those old time legacy schemes, they were probably not updated as regularly as they should have been. Remember, now I was in graduate school in the late 80s, early 90s. So this was, the end of, and then, kind of the waning period of this gigantic merger mania that happened in the 1980s. And so a lot of times you'd look at these SIC codes and you'd see a company that merged with 4 other companies and they're still in the pretzel industry. And you think that doesn't make any sense. So these modern schemes here, these things are updated at least annually. So we call these the global industry classification standards. That's pretty much the one that I remember and that my colleagues use. And so they're grouped by similarity of products. So some of these people do public companies. Some of these people do private companies. Boy, if the Institute says, which of the following covers public companies? Or which of the following covers private companies? Boy, that's a super, super simple question. I can't imagine that they would ask that. So what happens here then in these new time classifications is that the company then is placed in a single group in that lowest tier where groups make up the higher tier. So you look at these things. I mean, you could have, I don't want to say 100, but you're not going to have 100 of these, but you have these little tiers like a pyramid. And what essentially happens then is that you have a reasonable classification of a company. Now, I always tell my students, and this is probably not part of the LOS, I tell my students that, look, if you're going to evaluate Betty's company over here, you need to evaluate her business segment on pretzels, and you need to evaluate her business segment on potato chips. You need to do those separately, and then in the end, combine those if you want to, but separately. Let's focus on that, and that, of course, represents a combination of industry analysis and security analysis. So here's a little flow chart. This adds some value to how these companies are grouped. So there are a bunch of questions that we start over on the left-hand side, and then we work our way all the way over to the right. So we ask the question, is it single or multiple segments, right? So if I'm Jim's Pretzel Factory and that's all I do, let's go up to the purple, right? Single, then we just classify it that way. I mean, that's super obvious. But if we have multiple business segments, then what do? We need to ask Betty over there, all right, where do you get your revenues? This is what the Institute focus on. I personally would focus more, revenues, that's the top of the income statement. I would focus on operating cash flows, but that's just my background and my preference. Maybe that's my PhD studies talking. But what the Institute wants you to do is remember the 60%, right? If they're 60% revenue, then we'll classify them on whatever it is. Like if Betty does 80% pretzels and 20% potato chips, then we're going to lump her into that pretzel category. But then what if she's got 48% and 52%, well, then we have to ask ourselves the question, do we hit the 50%? Right? And so now we kind of get it into a little bit more granularity. Notice 50% revenues or profits or assets. I would like cash flows to be, one step before, but that's just my own personal kinds of thought. So then look over in the far right. This is what I said earlier, right? In that previous slide, we used, I think the word judgment was written down there. So discretion. What does that mean? Well, you know what? If you're analyzing the snack food industry for 5 or 10 years, and then here comes Betty, pops up on your screen, and you can look at Betty and say, all right, let's do the percentages. Let's look at her balance sheet. Let's look at her income statement. Let's figure this out. And then probably what you're going to do is ask Betty and say something like, Betty, what do you think of yourself as? Are you a pretzel or are you a potato chip? And Betty will probably say, you know what? I've been eating pretzels my whole life. I love pretzels. I've branched off into potato chips, but that's really not my focus. So, that discretion, and here's probably the likely exam question. What is the core? What is the core business of Betty? And can we figure out what that core is by the blue column there, the blue box? Or do we need to ask Betty? And of course, we're probably not going to have a conversation with Betty, but we might be able to have a conversation with the board and with the executive leadership team. And Betty could probably be in there, but you get the idea. Discretion. That's probably the focus on the question of the question, right? All right, so here are these global industry classification standards, and I'm going to take you through this real quickly. Watch this. So here and here. So we have three. Whoops, I went the wrong way. We have three of these slides. I can't imagine the Institute would say, hey, what's the difference between the global and the benchmark? Notice that we highlighted it there. So 3. So both have 11, right? But this benchmark says, wait a minute, we're going to call it basic materials. So that's kind of just a subtle difference in there. I'm not sure that you really need to know this. I would go ahead and remember 11 industries, and then here this Refinitiv, they have 14 different sectors. This is what they call this, and there's some red that are highlighted. So I'm not quite sure how you want to approach this for an exam question. I've tried to think of how I would ask this question, and I'm not sure that I've come up with any good questions. So. Here are the challenges. This is what I was saying earlier, right? Classifying companies based on a business model, right? Grouping multi-product companies, geographic limitations, changes in classifications over time. This is a really good question, I think, much better than back here. So let's just assume that we pick one of these things and we find a company that's in let's do the utility industry. So the Institute could say something like, here's Refinitiv. We have a company here, let's call it, Jim's Water Company. We think it's a utility company. What are the challenges? And the challenges might be, well, Jim processes water from an aquifer over here. Well, that makes perfect sense. But it might be that, hey, Jim bottles his water and sells it in Ireland. Well, that's a little bit of a different issue then, right? We're going from a utility company to a bottled water global company. Well, how do we group that in multi-product companies? So the idea here is that know these classifications, and I think these are really, really good questions about the difficulties in identifying and assigning a class to a particular company. Now we can have some kind of alternative method of grouping companies. I mean, we can rely on these third-party people, and of course we're going to do that. But we can also do it on our own. We can do it by geography. We can do it based on sensitivities. We can based on statistical similarities. Oh my gosh, so there we go. We've got all of these quantitative methods that the Institute has taught us back in those early learning modules. And we could say, hey, why don't you use regression analysis over here to find some similarities between and among these companies and go ahead and classify them. Oh, that makes perfect sense. And then the Institute has separate learning modules at all 3 levels on ESG characteristics. Now, what I will do is call your attention to a question at the end of this learning module. There are 8 of them, and there's one of them that refers to this number 2 here. Let's go ahead and identify a stock as being cyclical, or sometimes the term is non-cyclical, but a lot of people use the term defensive. And so just think about the difference between a cyclical and a non-cyclical. Think about in terms of a beta, right? What do I teach you about beta? Beta is just essentially a measure of sensitivity. And so if you go to Target and you buy noodles because you love spaghetti, you're probably going to buy noodles whether you make a lot of money or you don't make any money, right? So that's probably so Jim's Noodle Company is probably a defensive company. Does that make sense? As opposed to those companies that are very cyclical. And these things change all along. I observe my family members over the years, and they don't seem to adjust their spending habits based on the economy. So I'm not quite sure what that means. Anyway, alternative methods. So the Institute thought this was important enough to ask a question at the end of this learning module. So I would be prepared for the defensive and cyclical, and then the other 3. These are really good questions. Yeah, so how are we going to determine an industry size? Well, let's just do a Google search. I did it right before I came on to create this recording. What did I say? Total pretzel market in the United States was $7 or $8 billion. So that's super easy. But then what we need to do is go out and figure out how many companies out there sell pretzels. And let's go ahead and add up their market share. We're probably not going to get all the companies that add up to 100%. But if we could get the companies that add up to 60 or 70% or some number, then we can survey them, right? And we can ask them, all right, how many bags of pretzels did you sell last year? What was your historical growth rate? We can ask all these kinds of questions. Now, of course, as good lawyers, we're going to go to their financial statements, all 6 or 7 of them, and we're going to have a sense of what the answers to these questions are. But this survey then is going to help us to refine our knowledge of that industry so that we are better able to define it. Yeah, so what about industry size? How are we going to do this? What did I say? So total dollar amount of pretzels sold. We could do it based on total number of bags of pretzels sold, total pounds of pretzels sold. I wouldn't even have any idea. You probably wouldn't do it in pounds. You'd probably do it in tons. I don't even know what that means, but you could do this all different sorts of ways to get that industry size. Just make sure that if you do it on bags of pretzels for this company, you do it in bags of pretzels for that company, and then bags of pretzels for the entire industry. Yeah, what we can do is look at these economic pointers. We can take a look at GDP, take a look at unemployment. And of course, we can do this at the macro federal level, but then we also need to go ahead and look at, these individual geographies and say, okay, there are lots of people here in this part of the country. They love their pretzels. Over here in this part of the country, they don't even know how to spell pretzel, right? So approaches to estimating industry size can be broad or it can be deep. Now, I think this is really the great question here. I said this in my introduction. I asked my students, get the size, but then get the growth rate. And there are tons and tons of organizations out there that will estimate growth rates for different industries. So, here, it's as simple as this. Here's the pretzel industry this year. What's it going to be next year? Is it going to be this or is it going to be this? So how do we determine the industry's expansion pace? Well, we can clearly go to the individual company's balance sheet and income statement and then put them in an Excel spreadsheet and then copy and paste and do a sum. We can do all that kind of stuff. So we can take a look at history and we can say, all right, if history repeats itself, then we're going to have this estimate of growth rate. But I think the better model is to go ahead, take a look at history, estimate what the historical growth rate has been, use that as a base for a estimate of future growth rates, and then adjust that estimate based on risk premiums that are currently driving the industry today. So what are those risk premiums? Well, they could be almost anything. In the pretzel market, they would be the cost of corn and the cost of wheat and the cost of salt and the cost of sugar. All those inputs, they would be, kind of these risk drivers. What you can do is something that Morningstar does, that you guys are aware of. Bloomberg does this. Everyone out there puts some kind of a style box together. So if we lump these into non-cyclical or defensive stocks and cyclical stocks, we can have mature or growth firms. And there we go. We've lumped some of those in there. And these are kind of general answers to how do you put a particular company inside of one of these boxes. And so look it down at the bottom: economic trends, technological advancements, sustainability of high growth rates. That's one of my favorite words out there. Market penetration level, and really what is the market? So here, mature industries, what do they have? Reached market saturation. So we know all about that from our previous conversations, especially on business cycles. So what are these business cycle sensitivities, right? Pricing strategies, interest rates. In the last year or two, if you're regular readers of the Wall Street Journal, and I hope you are, you'll note that interest rates in the early 2020s have increased dramatically. What impact has this had not only on construction, not only on the housing market, but what about the real estate market in terms of the real estate agents? There's a huge thing out there in the United States these days about commissions, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those factors that influence the industry, and let me go back here real quickly, how those factors impact growth. I think those are the best questions. Yeah, look at that top arrow point here. This is always an issue. What happens when there are these limitations that exist distinguishing between growth and mature companies? Let's just take Betty over there. Betty might be in her pretzel segment might be in the mature industry, but she might be growing because she has a special way of making potato chips. Maybe she sprinkles chocolate on the potato chips, and this is taking the country by storm. Now, how can we measure profitability? Well, oh boy, I hate to say this, but let's go back to our quantitative methods, and we're going to do this. Now, you guys don't know this at the level that you will after you pass level 1, but when we get into level 2, we're going to do lots and lots of fun quantitative methods on time series. So the best approach to gauge this profitability is probably through some kind of a time series approach. And all we're going to do is take a look at a statistical relationship between the change in revenue over some statistical time period. And we use that regression analysis or any other kind of statistical analysis to give us a better sense of what that industry profitability is going to be. It can be before tax, it can be after tax. Now, the limitations are tremendous because there are lots of problems with time series analyses. We'll do all that in level 2. And I promise you, some of you are going to say, you know what, Jim, this time series stuff is the best thing I ever learned. And some of you are going to say, you know what, an eigenvalue? What the heck is that? I don't ever want to hear that term again. But you're going to need to know it to be able to pass level 2. And of course, it's my job and it's the CFA Institute's job to convince you that everything inside of the program is really, really important for your success in maintaining your skill set. Yeah, market share. This is what I was saying earlier. So you got this market here. How much can we reach in and capture? So if Jim's Pretzel Factory, if we just make regular old pretzels, maybe we're going to expand into the soft pretzel market. Oh my gosh. So what's the market share? How much extra market share can we capture? And that, of course, depends on what's the size of the industry. And here's the ultimate consumer question. How many people can we convince to continue eating pretzels? And how many people who don't eat pretzels can we convince to begin eating pretzels and then to continue eating pretzels there? So notice that we've got this range of estimates. So we'll go back to our quantitative methods and say something like, hey, let's put together a 95% confidence interval about this market share. So maybe this year we have 5%. Next year we hope to get between 6 and 7%. And that confidence interval is going to depend on normal distributions. It's going to depend on our point estimate. It's going to depend on, well, all the stuff that we've been talking about, not just in this slide, but in all of the other slides. Now, notice down at the bottom, there's this concept of merging. So what does this mean? I did say something earlier about Betty merging and Jim's pretzel factory merging. What can we do? Well, it's very critical to evaluate the growth rate at the company level and at the industry level organically, right? That means that without merging. I mean, think about it. If I'm Jim and I have 100 in revenues and Betty over there has 100 in revenues and we merge, well, 100 plus 100 is 200. Let's assume there are no synergies. Well, that doesn't change. That doesn't change the industry revenues, right? 100 and 100 doesn't matter if it's separate or if it's together, it's still 200. Now, I have to pause and do a comma there. Of course, what happens if there are synergies? And this is why the Institute has learning modules on the synergistic effects of mergers. So if I have 100 and Betty has 100 and we merge and then we have 300, well, then that is something that's going to impact the entire industry. Nevertheless, we want to separate that synergy from the organic growth. Here's another question that shows up at the end of the learning module. So I'm going to tell you to go ahead and memorize this HHI index. These two dudes, Herfindahl and Hirschman, they came up with this idea that, hey, you know what? Let's go ahead and figure out how much concentration. Is it a perfect market, or are we approaching an oligopoly, or is there a monopoly? So here's the idea. You know, if there are 3 firms in the pretzel industry, and I'm Jim, and there's Betty, and over there's Frank, right? So we got the three of us. The three of us have 90%, 30, 30, and 30. What kind of concentration level would you say that is? Well, you would probably say, that's equally distributed. There's only 3 firms. Maybe we're worried about just only 3 firms because we could collude and we could, get together and say, you know what? Our input prices are rising. Let's go ahead and increase our price to our customers by 10% each. We do all that. That's probably against some law out there. So what these two dudes did was come up with a more efficient measure of concentration. And so all we're going to do is take my 30 and Betty's 30 and Frank's 30, and we're going to square those numbers. So there's the S sub I squared. So here's just a quick example. So we dominated 4 firms, 40%, 30%, 20%, and 10%. So note that they sum to 100. So there's only 4 firms in this industry. Doesn't have to be the case. So if you do all this squared, you get 3,000. And notice in the case of a monopoly, that would be 100 squared, so that would be 10,000. So the question then becomes, well, where do we define concentrations and how do we figure this out? So look at that second embedded bullet point. And antitrust agencies in various nations, they think that an index between 1,500 and 2,500 is moderately concentrated. So if you read the Wall Street Journal, you'll read that the U.S. Department of Justice, they'll say something like, oh, we think this industry might be too heavily concentrated. So we might think about regulating. We might think about coming in and chopping up this company. Oh boy, isn't there talk for, I don't know, it's been 10 years now for coming in and chopping up Amazon. Chopping up Apple, chopping. And, the government can do whatever it wants, right? The government can say, you know what, we think you're a monopoly or an oligopoly, whatever it is. So we're going to bring this suit against you. And then it goes to court and we try to figure it out. So clearly above 2,500, there's going to be some legal action. Between 15 and 25, there's potential right there. So, I would remember the range, and I would remember that 2,500. I would also remember the 200 points after a merger. So this brings in, well, what do we say down there? Face regulatory hurdles. This means that government is going to come in and be more interested in what's going on. Let's go ahead and spend some time talking about Porter's 5 forces and the PESTLE framework. A couple of interesting things before we get into some slides on the 5 forces. Look at that second arrow point. I think this is a good potential exam question. If we have intense forces, right? What did I say earlier? Porter's 5, they're essentially supply chain things. So if we have intense forces, what that means is that there's probably going to be some type of reduced profitability for at least some companies within that industry. Maybe not all companies in the industry. Maybe, but maybe not. And then on the other hand, milder forces. So look for those terms on the exam, intense forces and mild forces. So there's potential for, and I'm not going to go back here. Remember that slide? What are we doing this for? That second reason was to uncover positive net present value projects. So if we have mild of these 5 forces, then there's probably going to be an increase in the net present value of our existing product lines. What are we doing? This is a qualitative evaluation of the profitability drivers. All right, so let's go ahead and work through each one of these. So the threat of new entrants. What am I worried about? What is Betty worried about? What is Frank worried about? We're worried about Joan over there, who's thinking about making pretzels or potato chips. So how do we evaluate whether or not there is a threat of new entrants? Well, here we have a list of some of these things. Are there economies of scale? Are there economies of scope available? Do we take advantage of them? And is it possible for others to look at our factory and say, you know what, Jim's doing that over there. I can do it. I can do it even a better way. So remember, what is that? The third and fourth. Remember economies of scale and economies of scope. We've talked about that at length in other learning modules. Go back up to the top. What about network effects? What does this mean? What is this? What is the distribution network? What does this mean for our potential competition? And then I always talk about brand loyalty, switching costs. Do we have access to scarce resources? By the way, that favored access to scarce resources, that's either a correct or an incorrect answer on one of the problems at the end of this learning module. I can't remember which it is, but you get the sense here that, if you know these bolded words here, we talk about this at length here, economies, gains, loyalty, switching costs. If you know those in relation to threat of new entrants, you ought to be able to answer those questions. I'll tell you what, during COVID and then inflation, I promise you that my wife and my family, we're doing lots and lots of substitutes out there, right? So when you have inflation, what's going to happen? There's this idea that somebody else could come in and offer it at a cheaper price, right? Or can we substitute it? Are we gonna have fillets for dinner every Friday night, or are we gonna substitute hamburgers? All right. So what does that mean for our farm? If we're a farmer, do we take our cows and do we make fillets out of them, or do we take our cows and we make milk out of them, or do we take our cows and make hamburger out of them? Clearly, I'm not a farmer. I have no idea what I'm talking about. But, you get the sense of a good financial analyst is going to know the answer to all of these questions. Remember, the Institute's not going to ask you to be a farmer on the exam, but it will ask you to evaluate what is the potential substitute for what was my product line, pretzels, right? Do we want peanuts? Is that a substitute? I don't know. We got to worry about peanut allergies. There's tons and tons of things to worry about it. Here we go. Bargaining power of consumers. what does that mean? Is there a small number of dominant customers that characterize the industry? Is the product standard? I mean, is my pretzel, does it look like every other pretzel out there? Or am I like Pringles? You remember when Pringles first came out? You guys weren't even alive when it came out. Pringles came in a tennis ball can. I mean, imagine that. And every potato chip looked exactly the same as every other potato chip out there. This was revolutionary in the potato chip industry, but now there are a handful of companies out there that sell potato chips in a can. So is a potato chip, is that a standard? Is that a standardized product? I guess we thought it was, and then we came along with these potato chips that all look the same, and so we differentiated them. All right, so that's important in terms of these bargaining power of consumers. And then how about that fourth one there? I think this is a good potential exam question. Significant portion of the customer's budget. You know, when we had all of our children living in the house, what did we do? We just spent tons of money on food. That's all we did. We just bought food and they ate it and they ate more. And no matter how much food we bought, they were like, hey, we need more food. So that took up a substantial portion of our budget, which meant that we probably didn't buy a car. We probably didn't buy a hot tub. We didn't buy, or at least a new car. We didn't buy a hot tub. We didn't go on vacation. We didn't do all this stuff because we were taking care of our children. So significant portion of the customer's budget. Yeah, backward integration. My father, you guys listen to me in my other recordings, you should remember this. My father was the most proud farmer that ever lived. And when I say farmer, I just mean he had a garden in the back. And, he would say things like, boy, I went to the market and I had to pay $1 for this tomato. Why don't I just grow the tomato? And my dad was so proud of his tomatoes. I mean, it was like he loved his tomatoes more than he loved his children. He would bring this tomato into the house and he would say, look what I did. Look what I did. And I was like, dude, you may have planted it, but there were other factors out there. So backward integration. Are we going to do something like that? Like my father. You've heard me use this example before, and this relates to not only bargaining power of consumers, but also other kinds of threats. There are farms in the Midwest that go out with a shovel and they collect the droppings from all of the animals that are out in the fields. And they come in and they put it in and they smash it and they do something with it. And the gas is released and they use that to provide air conditioning and heat and whatever it is. What happens is these farmers, then they don't need to buy electricity, or they don't need to buy natural gas, or they don't need to buy nuclear power from those utility companies because they're doing it on their own. So think about that as backward integration. As unpleasant as it might seem to be the shovel dude out there who's collecting all of the cow waste. It's just a great example of the power of the brain, right? If you put your mind to it, you can turn anything into something productive. Maybe not anything. All right, so here's the other side of the supply chain, the bargaining power of suppliers. And all of those, it's a similar kind of a conversation as we had at the other side of the supply chain. And then how about rivalry? There are firms out there that really just don't like each other and they love to compete and they love to do all sorts of things. Those of you who are homeowners will know this. If you have an issue in your house and you want to redo your basement, or you need new plumbing, or whatever it is, you always bring in a handful of carpenters or plumbers or whoever it is. And inevitably, when you have your third plumber in, the third plumber will say, oh, I saw Eddie the plumber leaving your house the other day. Did you have him over here? Oh, he stinks. Eddie the plumber, he's not going to do a good job. So there's this intense rivalry and competition. And so this can be super healthy, but it might not be at some point. All right, let's move on from Porter to PESTLE. And we've had this conversation in previous learning modules. So let's go ahead and do this as quickly as we can. So what are the politics involved, and what does that mean? Politics at the national level, politics at the local level. So we've had great conversations on fiscal and monetary policies, government's direct intervention in markets. So just think about the Treasury Department borrowing, and think about the Fed out there buying mortgage-backed securities. How about regulatory shifts? You know, this is a big deal now. Are we shifting towards getting rid of carbon? You know, we have this concept of carbon-free society. Is there going to be a government policy that says, you know what, we need to do this by 2050? I think we have some of those things out there. Geopolitical developments, of course, there's lots and lots of bad things that are going on in the world. How do they impact each particular industry? So this is what I was talking about with the carbon. So there's the energy sector. So go ahead and just read the Wall Street Journal one day and you'll be up to date on how those political and politicians can influence. So, you know, here's the thing. In the United States, there has been only one time during my lifetime where I paid over $4 a gallon for gasoline. And it was sometime after COVID. You know, so short-term political desire, stable and low energy prices. I'm going to go ahead and editorialize here for just a second. Politicians ought to take a little microeconomics class and just learn about supply and demand, and that would probably be a recipe for establishing short-term stability and low energy prices. All right, yeah, climate accords. We have all of these organizations out there who are saying something like, hey, you know what? We're polluting the atmosphere and we need to take these steps to reduce the emissions. You know, I don't know anybody in my circle and my professional life who is pro-pollution. I don't ever see anybody out there saying, hey, look at that factory out there. They're polluting. That's really a great thing. What we need are reasonable laws and regulations and rules to say, okay, let's reasonably reduce these emissions. All right, and then there are activities of OPEC. I bet you know all about OPEC. So healthcare sector, the defense sector. I'm not sure how the Institute is going to ask these kinds of questions in these particular sectors. And, you know, it mentions these three, but it could pick anything out there. My advice is to say something like, whatever the Institute gives you about some type of government intervention, ask yourself the question about marginal cost, marginal benefit for that particular industry. And I think that will lead you to the correct answer, whether it's in the energy sector or any other sector that the Institute might pick. I surely hope I don't have to tell you about economic influences on an industry. We've done all this before. There's a list of just a handful of these macroeconomic variables. But I think the interesting question here is that second teardrop point. Some of these influences are cyclical. Some of these influences are structural. How do those cyclical and structural shifts, how do they impact the industry size and the industry growth rate? Social influences, cultural and consumer trends. You know, there's this word populism that has been important in the United States for, going on almost a decade here. Pivotal in shaping industries. You know, some of these cultural and consumer trends are positive. Some of these are negative. What most firms seem to like to do is they like to lobby. They like to advertise. They like to place in social media. They put their reputation at stake. I won't mention any companies here for the recording, but those of you who read the Wall Street Journal will know there's lots of companies out there that took a position and they advertised, and their sales, they either increased or they decreased based on that particular idea. So my advice here for social influences is just like it was before. What is the goal of this corporate decision, and is it likely to increase or decrease both size of the industry and the market share of that individual company inside of that industry? Now, on a more global level, what we could do is we could not have just individual companies taking social or cultural positions. We could have entire industries taking social or cultural positions. So don't forget that. How about technology? We know all about technology from our microeconomic conversations, right? Increase in technology. What that does, it shifts the demand curve upward. And so what does that mean? If we can make pretzels, suppose I'm making a bag of pretzels and it used to take me 10 minutes to make a bag of pretzel, but all of a sudden I can make it in 2 minutes and it costs me less. Wow, what does that mean? Well, that profitability is going to dramatically increase both at the company level and at the industry level. Whoops, I went the wrong way there. Yeah, so technology is typically led by the industry incumbents. I guess I can generally agree with that, but there are lots and lots of really smart people out there who don't work for a large company or coming up with all these tremendous ideas. Look down at the bottom teardrop point. There's this idea of an innovator's dilemma, and this is it's either a question or an answer at one of those 8 problems at the end. Yeah, so there's a dilemma for innovation. They may embrace disruptive innovations, risking current business decline or preventing market share. So we have to worry about that. Or they ignore these disruptive innovations, which preserve short-term profits. And so what does that mean? We have this idea that, what did I say? It took us 10 minutes to make a bag of pretzels. Now it takes us 4 minutes to make a bag of pretzels. Well, how much did it cost us? How much does that technology cost us to reduce that from 10 minutes down to 4 minutes? Once again, this is a dilemma. Do you go ahead and make the investment to get the profit? Marginal cost, marginal benefit. This innovator's dilemma is exactly kind of a qualitative step back of the capital budgeting stuff that we do in estimating cash flows and weighted average cost of capital, to come up with a positive or a negative net present value. Legal influences on an industry, what this means is it's got to be related to the politics. Remember, the politicians, what they can do is they can pass laws, right? So then we have to worry about the laws. But back in that first one in the PESTLE, they can do lots of other stuff out there that is not really a law, but it's kind of if you don't do this, then we're going to impose some kind of sanctions on you. Yeah, so legal influences alter industry operations, which could either be beneficial or harmful. I mean, suppose Congress came and said, you know what, if you eat a pretzel that has more than, I'm going to make this up because I don't know anything about the science. If you eat a pretzel that has more than 10 grams of salt on it, you're going to die. Well, what would happen to me, Jim? What would happen to Betty? What would happen to Frank? We would be like, wait a minute, what happened to our lobbyists in Washington? Didn't we hear about this? All right, so we got to make these adjustments to existing regulations. We need to worry about extra regulations, new regulations. Tobacco and cannabis, the Institute does go ahead and mention those. I'm not going to editorialize on either one of those. I'll just say something like, my mother might still be alive if she wasn't a puffer. And how about environmental influences on industry? So environmental, what we're going to do is say something like, all right, nobody likes to pollute, but how do we manage to reduce pollution? We'll just call it carbon emission. How do we manage to reduce carbon emission without getting Congress to impose a law, right? So we're saying we've got these environmental influences, and you guys know this. There are lots and lots of organizations out there who are suggesting, and the SEC is open-minded to this, that companies ought to report their carbon footprint. We know whatever that means. They ought to be able to say, you know what, here's our revenues, here's our income, here's our cash flows, and by the way, here's how we're impacting the economy, and here's how we're improving the economy. Yeah, look at that bottom. Not adapting could result in lost market share due to eco-friendly alternatives. All right, how about this last LOS? Understanding competitive strategy, right? We can do intentional or we can do unintentional. And what I want you to do is focus first on that intentional. Look at the example of Apple's continuous innovation. What we say in the academic world is that what firms do is they invest in human capital, right? Brain work, and they invest in technology. And human capital and technology has what's known as a latent asset. Some people refer to it as an embedded option. Like Apple, I promise you, 30 years ago, Apple was looking at, how about if I go back 40 years? Apple was looking at the Sony Walkman. You guys even know that this thing existed? You put a cassette tape in this thing and it weighed 100 pounds and you plugged it in and you had some earphones. And this was an awesome innovation, but I promise you, those Apple people, they were looking at this thing and they were saying, wait a minute, what's technology going to do? They were saying, look, sooner or later, someone's going to turn music into a digital file. What are we going to be able to do? And all of a sudden, Apple, because they invested, because they knew all about the Sony Walkman, they were able to make this, continuous innovation and high quality product design. So now, what do my family members do? They have this thing right here, right? And they can make a call, they can text, and they can listen to their music. And it's my contention that they can listen to their music on their iPhone. And by the way, on my Android, I listen to my music. I'm a rock and roll dude. I listen to Alice Cooper and Led Zeppelin and Humble Pie. There's your homework assignment. Go listen to one song from all three of those tremendous groups. But I promise you that Apple didn't know this back in 1990 or whenever they started doing this stuff. They didn't know where it was going to lead, but they knew it was going to lead somewhere and they wanted to be at the forefront. So think of those intentional things as an embedded option or a latent asset that we're learning from this. And sooner or later, we're going to figure something out that's really, really good, right? Positive net present value projects. Now, unintentional, what this simply means is that what we're going to do is we're going to say, you know what, Betty's over there. She's doing pretzels, we're doing pretzels. She does potato chips, oh my gosh, we're going to go ahead and do potato chips. So whatever happens in the industry, we're going to be a follower. So there's another way to think of intentional versus unintentional, followers or leaders. Now, how about if we evaluate this competitive strategy? Well, we just went through this. We're going to go ahead and we're going to combine Porter. We're going to combine PESTLE. And then look at that third one down here. We're going to say something like, all right, we looked at the industry. We know all about Porter and PESTLE. But now let's look at this individual company. Does this company have the resources and the capabilities to execute the strategy? In other words, is Jim smart enough to make potato chips that are going to be competitive with Betty's potato chips? Because first of all, I have to make a chip that people are going to bite into and say, oh my gosh, this is at least as good as Betty. And then they'll say, how much does it cost? If they bite into it and say, hey, this is better than Betty, oh my gosh, well then I can charge more, right? If they say, boy, this stinks, what does Jim know about chips? Well, then I'm out of the potato chip industry. Right? So answers to these questions are specific to each company and each industry. So how are we going to do this? Well, we can do the cost leadership, we can do differentiation, and we can do focus. So these are the means of executing this particular strategy. So you have these columns here. We've talked at length about these three in previous learning modules. So you probably don't need me to add anything in there. But look, cost leadership, got to think of economies of scale and economies of scope, right? These are all of our operations. Cost leadership, this is what I think of all the time. You know, when I pull into our convenience store to get gas, I look at this and gas. Remember, I've only paid over $4 one time in my life for a gallon of gas. So nowadays, you know, it's $3 and whatever it is, you know, I'll do that. But then I'll think, you know what, I'm a little thirsty, so I'm going to go in and get a bottle of water. So I pay $1 for a bottle of water. They probably paid 5 cents for that bottle of water. So they make 95 cents on the bottle of water. Maybe they lose a little bit on the gas. Maybe they gain a little bit. Who knows with gas stations? But you get the idea. We're going to have this cost leadership. We're going to say something like, you know what, I want to be known for selling Jim a bottle of water that he loves having a bottle of water, and I'm going to get him into the store by doing some other things, right? Differentiation, I don't really know how you differentiate a bottle of water, but I know how you can differentiate a pretzel. My father, the great gardener slash farmer, he loved his hard pretzels. And he used to buy his hard pretzels from one particular person who made hard pretzels. And he wouldn't eat any other hard pretzels. And I would look at my dad, I'm like, dude, what is it about this pretzel that makes it the best? He goes, boy, when I drink my Budweiser and I eat this pretzel, it's the best thing ever. So, differentiation, whatever that company did, it differentiated for my dad. Now, my dad probably didn't pay attention to advertising. He probably was brand loyal. He didn't really care about customer service. What he cared about was that superior quality. So that's the focus of differentiation. Now, focus, what you can do is proximity to customers. You can do copyrights. You can incorporate both of these things. But this is why everywhere you go, at least where I live, when you're driving on a highway, you look over there and there's an Amazon distribution facility. So what does that mean? Sooner or later, there's going to be an Amazon. Do you guys ever see Independence Day, that movie where the aliens, they come down and it's some massive spaceship? Well, that's what I think of Amazon. It's this massive spaceship. So what's going to happen is I'm going to go ahead and order a belt. And I'm going to click the order the belt, and it's going to cost $20 or whatever it is. And then I'm going to go out to my backyard, and this spaceship is going to drop the belt within 5 minutes. So proximity to customers, think about that. How about this? Our strategy. When we look at those Porter's 5 forces, what we're going to do is we're going to identify strengths and weaknesses inside of the industry and how we relate to that industry. So which of these 5 forces which of these are the most important? How are we going to defend against new entrants, substitutes, all these kinds of things? We're going to do it with the same thing that we did before: cost, differentiation, and focus. And then industry appropriateness and risks to the strategy. We're going to go ahead and divide these again into those 3 different types of strategies. And we're going to say something like, let's go ahead and identify what are these risks and how are we going to manage those particular risks. And that takes us through all of our LOSs. I want you to go to the learning module, go to the very end. 8 really, really good questions. I've given you at least some of the questions and some of the answers, so I bet you could do this in 5 minutes. So, hey, thanks for watching and good luck studying.